Welcome back to Season 2 of the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Menninger, and I am so grateful that you're joining us. When I started this podcast last year, my primary goal was to normalize the experience of imposter syndrome, to make it easier for us to talk about, and to access the support that we deserve. I am so grateful to everyone who has shared their stories with me, and I'm fascinated by the linkages between imposter syndrome and so many other facets of our lives. The conversations that we had last season led us in so many powerful directions. I'm excited to continue these conversations in Season 2. As always, if you have a story to share, please reach out to me. I would love to interview you. And if I can ever support you on your own imposter syndrome journey, I'd love to connect on that too. Thanks again for being here. Welcome, Gayani. I am so excited to have you here today, and I would love to start by asking you to introduce yourself to the listeners.
Hi, everyone. I am Gayani. Like Kim said, I am an intellectual property and business law attorney. I have my own practice. I am an entrepreneur. I've been in practicing law for now. I'm in my 6th year of practice, going into 7th soon. And before that, I was a scientist. I was at National Institutes of Health for 9 years doing biomedical research. So that's a little bit about me.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks for inviting me to be. Well, I invited myself to be on your podcast when you said if you want to join the podcast. So thank you for having me here.
Oh, I'm really glad that you raised your hand because I know it's not always easy to tell your story, but I'm really grateful that you're here today. And I want to just ask you initially the questions that I typically kick off with, which are, what does imposter syndrome mean to you? And how, if at all, has it shown up for you?
So I've been thinking about this question because, I met you at a webinar that you did for Johns Hopkins Alumni Group. Influencing from this, your seed or something to that effect. I forget the exact title. But I thought it's such an important discussions we're having as women who are in this professional world, business world, as business owners. So, and I think as we are walking this path, just to give a little bit of my background, I was born in Sri Lanka and I grew up in Los Angeles. And so I think because I'm a first generation, I'm an immigrant, I am a woman of color, I feel that sometimes I have in the past, and I'm working on this consciously, the imposter syndrome show up as you are not deserving of your position, your awards, whatever that you get. You feel like you are faking it. And, that whole saying that fake it until you make it, I think in a way that, and I get it, is get into that energy and walk forward. But I do think that sometimes you feel like, well, what if they find out that I'm really not like what they are tracing me to be? That's how I feel like it shows up for me. And I feel like sometimes it's the insecurities that show up, and everybody have these. And I think this is why it's important to have these discussions. That's why I volunteer to show up on your podcast, because I think it's important for everybody to hear. We all have it, but the key is not to let it paralyze you.
Yes. Yeah. And thank you again for being willing to tell your story, because that is, from my perspective, such a crucial part of this overall conversation is our willingness to own the fact that we have this experience. And I think sometimes, especially as women, we have this tendency to want to look like we've got it all figured out, right? We don't want people to see that we don't maybe know everything, can't do everything ourselves. We set these really high standards for ourselves. And that just increases the anxiety, it increases the perfectionism, it increases the comparisons that we make with people around us. And if we can just accept the fact that, you know what, Imposter syndrome is a thing for a reason, right?
Yeah.
It's a known phenomenon, right? And it doesn't make me any less capable or any less valuable than I am. It's simply a mindset that I need to manage from time to time.
Exactly. And I love that you brought up it's about your capabilities, not doubting them. We all have our setbacks. And I feel like if you think you're not going to fail at something, and if you fail at something, it's because not don't put it to my advice to anybody who have been through something where they felt like they failed at something. For me, when I decided to leave the graduate program, I was at a Johns Hopkins PhD program, and I decided to take a terminal master's and come to law. But there's a part of me kept on wondering, did I fail? Did I, even though I made this active decision based on what I wanted and what no longer aligned with me, to seek out what I wanted, there's a part of me that felt like I'm failing because I didn't finish it. But finishing it mean I would have stayed in that program for another 3-4 years being miserable, where I left that and took my power back and came to law school and finished in that 3 years and got a JD. So I think that idea of capabilities versus, your negative thoughts, your negative thought loops, and the stories you tell yourself is the key, like to manage those stories and to make sure that you are not, compounding it with saying it's lack of your capabilities instead of seeing it to what it is the key that we have to actively be aware of and work on.
Exactly. And what you're describing too, of having been in a PhD program, chosen to leave it and go in a different direction, is also a very common trigger of imposter syndrome. Anytime you shift gears, you sort of do something different from your peer group, right? That has a tendency to trigger self-doubt and to make us question our legitimacy in some way, right? So how did you get through that? Is there anything that you are, and I know a lot of this happens at a subconscious level, so it's not necessarily the case that you even know this, but were there things that you did or told yourself that helped you to get through those feelings of failure as you described them?
Yeah, so I think it's actually, honestly, it's a journey. You do a lot of work at certain points in your life. When I was leaving the program, I did do some therapy. I did go to a therapist that did cognitive therapy. And she helped me realize to stop the stories that I am telling myself. Like she helped me kind of dial down on the story. So these kind of like going to a therapist, going to a coach. I also have been working with some coaches on my journey, and they have really helped me open up, be more self-aware of my own stories and my own patterns of stories, what I tell myself when something happens. So that helps me to, when something do happen, I could zoom out after the initial reaction. I could zoom out and try to take in, okay, what did really happen? What is the story I'm telling myself at this point? And what should I be telling myself, right? This the whole empowerment journey. Like, what should you be doing? And just also, this where mindfulness really help. I do a lot of mindfulness meditations. Because that helps to go within and just kind of extract these judgments and be in a space of acceptance.
I love that. I think that the zooming out that you're describing too, coupled with that piece around acceptance, is so important, because when we're in this situation, it feels so heavy. There's so much weight to it. But if we can actually keep it in perspective, right?
Exactly.
We can see it so differently and so much more productively, for lack of a better word, right? We just get tangled up in, at least I speak for myself, if not for others, right? As somebody who has struggled with imposter syndrome and has had a lot of anxiety, I will get tangled up in the most ridiculously inconsequential things, like the things that I question about myself. And I just, but like you said, if you can zoom out and remember holistically who you are, right?
Exactly.
The importance of any one little thing that happens.
Well, I think the history of having a coach or having a therapist or having a good friend that knows you could really help talking to them, because sometimes you really do have to say it out loud to identify where the story is. Because like you said, a lot of it is a subconscious in the background. So like, we have these patterns, and I have been doing a lot of self-development, so you will hear that in what I'm saying, but it's part of it is that your self-awareness grows as you do these things, and there are tools that you could use to bring you back into alignment. So I think when something happened, when somebody criticizes you on something that you put your heart and soul into, not because you did an inadequate job, because for some reason you didn't meet their expectations, let's say. Well, and it's because maybe they didn't communicate the expectations to you in a way that you understood it. But here's the thing: when you are in that situation, sitting in that room with your boss, and they are criticizing you, saying you didn't do this and this, if you could zoom out of that moment afterwards and breathe into it, and then go into that situation and see, okay, where the miscommunication is help you to manage it. And I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, because I have left jobs where it was not in, there was no way to fix that communication, I felt like, because I feel like end of the day, you do have to meet in the middle. Like if they are not communicating to you in a way that you understand it, and you communicate that to them, and they're not, still they're kind of expecting you to meet, you cannot figure out their communication styles, and you are not communicating, then sometimes you just had to say, okay, this is not the best position for me, there's something better out there for me. So I do get that, but I do think but for your next position, don't take in that criticism with you. Empty that garbage out. That's what mindfulness does. That's what and mindfulness is a technique. So it's a practice. It's just like going to the gym. You have to keep going.
Exactly. I love the emptying the garbage. That's it's going to be one of my new favorite quotes. And I think you're right too. What you also bring up is the importance of, there's a lot of, I think, personal accountability that is noble and honorable, right? When we are dealing with imposter syndrome, we're taking on a lot of personal responsibility and again, holding ourselves to a high standard. But you're absolutely right that the situation influences our success as well. And we cannot control everything. We are only responsible for, I always say we're only responsible for 50% of any relationship that we have with another person. and so if you're beating yourself up because, to your point, in your example, you didn't meet the expectations of your manager, there's of course a piece of it that you own, but there's also likely a piece that your manager owns. And so
exactly,
not to take on the full burden of everything, right? To look at, okay, well, what is my part, but what can I ask for of my manager that will make that person
exactly
take ownership too.
I think it's so important to understand that what you need from that situation too. So if you are able to communicate to your manager and say, when you give me feedback this way, I don't I don't hear you, because you, like, if they're constantly screaming at you, and that's not how you, like, that's your response to somebody who's screaming, and I actually been in this kind of situation, I shut down. I don't, like, I like go into, like, I don't hear the, what they're trying to say, because if they're screaming, it's just like that, the parent that's screaming at the kid, right? Sometimes of course, we are all human, we do it, but if it's constantly happening, and that's not your communication style, that's not how you take feedback, then you do have to communicate that. And if that's their communication style and they're not changing that, then you do have to leave, right? You have to, because I think we owe it to ourselves to treat ourselves with respect, and respect ourselves enough to say enough is enough. You know what? This is not the this is not the manager I need. This is not how I want to be at work for like 10 hours a day.
That's right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I want to tie that to what you shared when we first started this conversation, if you're okay with this. You mentioned being
Yes.
a first generation immigrant. You mentioned being a woman of color. And I have been having a lot of conversations with women of color who talk about the environmental conditions that trigger imposter syndrome and the lack of psychological safety, the lack of inclusion in certain environments, right? And I would certainly put a disrespectful manager into that category. How has your experience been through that lens? Has any part of your background, do you think, influenced your experience with imposter syndrome or self-doubt more broadly? Are there things that you've experienced as a woman of color that maybe I haven't?
Well, I think one of the challenges for like women of color, and I am a dark-skinned South Asian, so I say that because I do get sometimes people don't really recognize where I'm from. Sometimes they don't know if I'm like from Trinidad or if I'm from India. So it's funny. But what I do think it does trigger certain things. For one thing, a lot of times, and the history of a lot of attorneys, we walk into a boardroom where there's a deal going on. It's usually you're the only woman there. And usually you are considered, like, if you don't introduce yourself as such, there is this expectation you're some kind of assistant. So I think it have influenced me in a way that, as far as how I behave, how I walk into a meeting, I make sure to introduce myself as who I am. It's not a way of like boasting my title. It's more about owning up to who I am, because if I just go in there and say, hi, I'm Gayani, they don't know who, they may not have looked at who's the list of people and associated me with the council that is present, in-house counsel or whatever the title. So I do make sure to say I'm an attorney, I'm intellectual property and business law. I say that because it's important, and I have seen sometimes, and this is not to put down somebody, but to just kind of become more aware. I sometimes have came across where sometimes even the women who are like Caucasian women who have been, who are not attorneys, who are like assistants, who would not acknowledge sometimes, I felt like, my position. They will say, oh, we girls all had to hang out together. There was one place I worked at where this one assistant who's a senior paralegal who always talked to like our interns. We had two other senior attorneys who are the partners of the firm, and then me and this senior paralegal, but she will always refer to those two as the attorneys and would never include me in that list. And I actually had to at one point I had to tell her in front of others, I'm an attorney too. And that's when it got to her to realize, oh, I wasn't, because the way she was saying things, she would say, oh, I will go ask the attorneys. I will have to check with the attorneys.
Ah, wow.
And I thought, and it's kind of one of the challenges is when you become this, when you're in this situation and you had to point that out, sometimes you're seen as the bad person, the bitchy person.
Mhm,
No, I'm
mhm.
sorry, I didn't mean to curse
No,
there.
no.
So like you seems to be the person, oh, she, but that doesn't happen to guys usually. And it's actually, I don't know if it's happened to Caucasian women who are attorneys. It may happen, but for sure for me, in my personal experience, I have several of those kind of situations where I had an assistant where it's an older female assistant who's Caucasian, and there was another situation, not the same person, where they would be like, oh, you could ask either me or Gayani. And I'm like, no, you cannot answer something for me because I'm the counsel, you're the assistant. You cannot like give legal advice. Like she will write this on email sometime. And I had to like actually tell her, no, you cannot say that. You have to say, if it's a legal question, please go to Gayani, because she
Wow.
is, like that idea, for some reason it seems to be a challenge. And I'm not sure if if I'm being highly sensitive. And that's the other thing, that's where that the imposter syndrome come in, where I feel like, oh, maybe I'm being highly sensitive because I am kind of annoyed and frustrated when this happened. It's because I'm like, if you're recognizing these other titles of other people and the guys, and they are, if they're attorney or whatever they are, but somehow I had to stand up for my title and to be like seen and be heard.
And that's such a perfect and unfortunate example of exactly what I was asking you about too, in terms of the environmental influences, right? Because it's one thing for us to walk into a room feeling like we don't belong, we're a fraud, something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's yet another thing to be treated that way by the people in the room. And that's a whole other level of pressure. And the strategies that you're describing having used of introducing yourself with your role of, letting people know, no, this is my title. This is how you need to include me, sound really well thought out, right? And effective. But I can't imagine that that's entirely comfortable, right? That you probably weren't feeling in the moment like that this was something that came naturally to you.
Yeah, I think.
Right? I mean that's gotta be an uncomfortable, for lack of a better term, right, situation to be in. How do you get stronger? How do you get to that place where you can now come in and announce yourself, so to speak?
I think you just had to keep doing it this way, that faking until making it don't make sense. Because I do think now I'm in my 6th year practice, I have gotten used to saying that who I am, because it is important for us to own up to who we are. We are not asking for something that we haven't earned. It's our, what we have already earned, right? So it's like this whole idea, like I'm not asking for entitlement. I am asking you to recognize who I am and be seen and heard. So I think that's the key, right? I think that's where I think going inward and settling into that feeling of, this is something I have to do to get to be recognized at the opinions I give or the discussions we have. Like going back to that email situation with that assistant, it was important for me to draw that boundary because my license is on the line.
Mhm.
I have said this before, like I have a, like as an attorney, if somebody who like come to her think, because she works for us, and like ask a question and she thinks she could answer it and she give an answer and they think it's coming from legal, like from me, then I get in trouble. So I think that's where you had to make sure that while it might be uncomfortable, while it's not the what your colleague who is not this look like you have to do, you still have to do it because that's how you have to set your boundary. Because and boundaries are good. Boundaries tells people where you are, who you are, and I think it allows others to kind of also allow you to like help others, right? To make sure they understand that they will get in trouble if they do that, because that's not in their job description, and that is a liability for everybody involved. So so
Yeah.
so I think it's like when you zoom out in that level, you see that, right? But when you're in that micro level of at that moment when you see that email and you had to call this person in and say you cannot say that, that's when you're like kind of in this, oh, am I being too harsh, am I being
Mhm.
like too controlling? There are all of these imposter syndrome like the thoughts come in.
Absolutely. And I think what you're saying too about being in your sixth year, right, has a lot to do with it too, that you get more confident and comfortable over time. It still has to be hard when you find yourself in that situation, even after all these years. But it sounds like the difference now is that you have different tools in your toolbox, right? It's not even,
Exactly.
yeah,
I
even though it may be disappointing, it's not entirely new. So you've been here before.
And you pay attention to the implicit bias teaching. Like the reason I have done implicit bias trainings, and those kind of things helps because it helps you to actually do a better job for yourself. So like if I'm showing up to a meeting, I make sure to I dress for that meeting, because the unfortunate thing is I don't have the same privilege as a middle-aged Caucasian uh, male attorney has, walking into a meeting even on a Saturday, being in very casual clothes. I need to dress for my part in a certain way to be taken seriously, and that's something, as a woman of color, I'm very well aware I cannot show up like my hair in a mess or something, in that sense, because yes, you can, but I think that's when you do that, you create an upper hill. And for me, I'd rather spend my energy at the being present for whatever we are doing than trying to prove that these are my qualifications. So I hope that made sense.
It makes perfect sense. Absolutely. And, I'm hearing a lot of tools that you have accessed, and you mentioned accessing resources like coaches or therapists. You talked about
Mm-hmm.
zooming out and the mindfulness piece. And you talked about, which I love this tip. I keep coming back to it, but I think it's just a great one for everybody who's in this situation to use, is to introduce yourself along with your role, so there's no ambiguity about why you're there and what you're there to do, right? Is there anything else that you have leaned on, or anything else that you would recommend to somebody else who's listening who may be feeling like their story is similar to yours?
Yeah, I would absolutely say like take your power back. And I think, like there are things you could do. Like there's so many great books out there. Like I listen to like Brene Brown, her, vulnerability, because it helps you connect at a better place. The reason I listen to these, and I'm a lifelong learner. I love learning new things. It's also what it does is give you tools as to what our human behavior, our human connection, right? And so instead of going into the blame and shame game of shaming somebody or blaming somebody for what they did, you could bring it back into like, okay, what can I change about the situation and be more present at that and claim, come in with confidence, right? Show up with confidence. I remember she had this Netflix talk that she talked about the critics. They are going to be critics. They are always critics, right? They're going to be people who love to give critique. But if you're not in the arena, I don't care about what you say. So you do have to get into that level too. I think you had to sometimes say, you know what, and look at somebody who's criticizing you, and if you feel that is not warranted, that's okay. Say it's not warranted. Like you have the right to say this is not a critical advice I'm going to take, because this is not something I need or I see as something I need to do. And draw your boundaries. Again, I think going back to like being in your power and drawing your boundaries, because I think everybody else will say there are people who's going to give you advice based on what they know. And it's okay to say, you know what, that might be true for you, but not for me. Thank you.
Oh my God. You said so many things there that are so powerful to me. And this whole idea of empowerment is really I would say that's always my bias, is towards self-empowerment, recognizing the really frustrating elements of what you're describing. Like when you were talking about having to wear a dress and do your hair and everything while the other guy shows up in really casual clothes, it makes me angry. It frustrates me, right? But it's also true to, it's an unfortunate reality that we face. And so I think while we work towards greater progress at a bigger level, you're absolutely right to think about it in terms less of, well, I'm not going to blame and shame the people in this room or the generations of history that have gotten us to this point, right? I'm going to empower myself to navigate the situation as powerfully as I can, right?
Well, it's what you're comfortable with, right? So I think that's where it's really had to be the key. Because if you're somebody thinking, you know what, if he's not dressing up, I don't want to dress up. I'm going to show up this way too. And that's a choice you're making. And I do think there is a power in your choice. And then, but when you show up, though, what you're willing to do, then you had to make those decisions, right? For me, I'm making that decision to show up dressed up. So my next step, instead of going in there and trying to establish my position, say I'm the in-house counsel, I'm doing this, or I'm the outside counsel, I'm the part of the, I'm negotiating this deal. Now you are like, you're going to have to kind of spend maybe some time establishing who you are, right? Like, but if you show up with that, like on the weekend, even if you show up in a more business attire, you're kind of already in that, because when you introduce yourself as you're the attorney, you're already, they kind of like, okay, I see why she's serious. Right.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. And I think it all comes back to our own feeling like we're in the biggest position of strength possible too, right? Because it would become a distraction to you if you showed up casually. You'd probably be in your own head a lot more too, right? Of like, oh no, what are they thinking?
Yeah, exactly. But if you show up dressed up and you are annoyed that you had to show up dressed up and you're still in your head, then that might not work for you.
That's true. That's true. And so you're right. It all comes down to choice, right? And I love what you were talking about too. I mean, and I think this ties directly to the boundary setting theme, is if you decide this is not a relationship with your manager, let's say, that works for you, if this is not a company that works for you, if this is not an environment that allows you to be your best self, you always have the choice to leave, as difficult as it might seem. And I know sometimes we don't, when you're in the situation, it kind of feels like we don't have other options. It's hard to see what those other options look like, but reminding ourselves that we have choices is really important.
Absolutely. I think, like when I was going through something bad, like a bad job situation, I was told, oh, just put up with it for 1 year, put up with it for 2 years, then you will be set. But for me, even like at that point, I was already in it for like 5 months. And I was like, you know what? My health and my life, quality of life, it's worth me leaving right now instead of putting up with it for another, like another 6 months to make that change. So I do think sometimes you had to do what's best for you, and like be comfortable, even if you're not comfortable with the unknown. Work with a therapist or a
Mhm.
coach to
Mhm.
get comfortable, because your life, quality of your life, you should be happy. You should be enjoying the moments, not be, we spend a lot of our time at work. So if you're spending 10 hours a day at work, that's a lot of your time, right? So
Mhm.
why be miserable even for one more day, right? I'm not saying go quit today, but I do think it's worth examining what are you trading, you know,
Yeah.
and talking to a coach or therapist or somebody who is you consider that could help you into that next level can really help. And there are also books out there that could help. There's programs out there that help. So, like that's an investment in yourself. Like if you're saying, oh, I don't have 1 hour to talk to a friend or a therapist. Well, really, do you not have 1 hour to invest in for yourself, your better mental health, your better, health, physical health? So I do think, we had to stop telling these stories of I don't have, whatever that is, end of that sentences, and instead look at it, why are you saying that? And just sit back and think, do I really not have this time?
That's right.
Because I think you can, and you may have to cut back on something else, but you prioritize, right?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I could talk to you all day. I still have like 50 questions I want to ask you, but in the spirit of time, what motivated you to want to tell your story today? And what are you hoping people will take away from it?
Well, I think because I have done a lot of different transitions. I went from science to law, and being at in-house at a corporation to a couple of law firms and launching my own practice and being an entrepreneur. I wanted people to know that you have a path, and it may not be straightforward, but if you take those chances and walk forward, leaving bad situations behind, you are you will end up at a better place. And don't be afraid to take chances. um I think that's what I want to share. I am much happier than I ever been, and I'm getting to do what I love doing, which is working with entrepreneurs and startups and helping them create their businesses. I literally help them incorporate businesses or get their trademarks. So like I have a lot of fun with my clients. I help them strategize on their business. So, like that's something I'm loving doing, but it got, you know, there was last year, like 2 years ago, I wanted to leave law because I was so miserable. so, so I do think, if something is not aligning, I think look into it, work with somebody, spend time with yourself. Like if it's just even 5 minutes while you drive, you turn off the radio and just pay attention to you. It will help you, get into that mindfulness space and expand and kind of walk into a better place.
I love it. Thank you so much. I have loved our conversation. I'm so grateful to you for being here. And like I said, I could talk to you all day. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Kim. I really appreciate you speaking with you too.
Thanks again for listening today. If you're struggling with imposter syndrome and you'd like additional support, check out the show notes for more resources or contact me directly. I would love to help you. And if you'd like to tell your story, I would love to interview you. You will find my contact info in the show notes, so reach out anytime. Thanks again.